If you had asked all the luminaries of Europe in 1729 who would be sitting on the throne of Russia 32 years later, none of them would have said the baby Sophia Frederick Auguste of Anhalt-Zerbst, daughter of a mediocre Saxon prince and a narcissistic and unhappy princess who had been married off politically to a man well above her age and below her station. None of those luminaries would even know who Sophia was. But truth is stranger than fiction, and the baby Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst would go on to be none other than Catherine the Great of Russia. It is one of the most fascinating tales of resilience of the human spirit and of how an unlikely figure can come to shape the world that we live in. Let's go inside the mind of Catherine the Great. When Sophia's mother, Johanna, gave birth on that cold Stettin autumn day, her hopes and dreams had been placed on carrying a male heir, a boy that would be her ticket out of the drudgery of Stettin and the isolated castle in which she lived, quite divorced from the excitement and luxury of court life that she had experienced as a teenager. Those hopes and dreams came crashing down when she bore a daughter instead. Immediately, baby Sophia was whisked away to the care of wet nurses, never to see so much as an inkling of her mother's love. This absence was made even more distinct in young Sophia's mind when her mother gave birth to a son. This boy appeared to have some form of disability, maybe rickets, we think, and he was doted on by his mother, lavishing all the care and love and attention that she had so deprived Sophia of. Sophia sealed off her emotions towards her mother, but her resentment never quite left her. She writes in her memoirs, "It was told of me that I was not very joyfully welcomed. My father thought I was an angel. My mother did not pay me much attention at all." A year and a half later, she gave birth to a son whom she idolized. I was merely tolerated, and often I was scolded with a violence and anger that I did not deserve. I felt this without being perfectly clear why. This lack of warmth and care from her mother had a profound effect on young Sophia, but in the coldness and injustice of her mother's treatment, there was born a resiliency in Sophie's mind, a resiliency that she would call upon many years later, a resiliency which Sophia was all too aware that she had cultivated, stating later in her memoirs of her life before coming to the throne, "I had lived for 18 years, for which 10 others would have gone mad, and 20 would have died of melancholy." Sophia's childhood did have one or two bright spots, however. She had a French governess, Elizabeth Cardell, who oversaw her education. In Cardell, the intellectually curious Sophia found a window into the culture of Europe, building her palace of the mind, being taught French through La Fontaine's fables and the dramas of Corneille and Racine and the comedies of Molière. However, not all of her tutors were liked by the young Sophia. A strict Lutheran army chaplain, Pastor Wagner, caught the brunt of her rebellious side. Sophia writes, "Very early it was noticed that I had a good memory. Therefore I was incessantly tormented with learning everything by heart. I still possess a German Bible in which all the verses I had to memorize are underlined with red ink, and I am convinced in my innermost soul that Herr Wagner was a blockhead." The more Wagner tried to mould Sophia with discipline and Lutheran sternness, the more she challenged him, asking how it could be that the infinite goodness of God could be reconciled with the horrors of the Last Judgment. Only Cardell's intercession allowed Sophia to escape the cane for what Wagner and Sophia's mother began to see as pride. In fact, Sophia's mother, Johanna, was determined to drive that trait out of her daughter, and soon took to calling her ugly at any opportune moment. Sophia was soon forbidden to express opinions to adults, or to speak unless spoken to. She obeyed this rule and maintained a respectful attitude towards her mother. But in this we see a tactfulness emerge in Sophia. Sophia learned to conceal her pride and humility, and this was to be a very valuable aid to her in moments of crisis that were still to come. But as horrible as it was to be called ugly by one's own mother, as is often the case in Sophia's life, the very things that would destroy others in some way ended up being a boon to her. She writes, "I don't know if I was really ugly, but I remember being often told that I was, and that I must therefore strive to show inward virtue and intelligence." Sophia did just that, and it became another case of Sophia turning lemons into lemonade. As much as her cruel mother took the opportunity to put Sophia down, cruel parents can still play large roles in granting their children better fates. And as the young Sophia's childhood progressed, her mother began to see her as an opportunity and started to tour her about North Germany, meeting this aunt here and this uncle here. Talk of Sophia's future marriage prospects seemed to consume Sophia's mother, and this was her opportunity to raise her own station, if she could procure a husband for Sophia of high status. But her chances weren't great. Every year there were new eligible adolescent princesses coming on the scene with greater social capital than a union with a small and insubstantial house of Zerbst could provide. However, in 1739, at the age of 10, Sophia and her mother visited Johanna's brother, one Adolphus Frederick, the Prince Bishop of Lübeck. The Prince Bishop had just become the guardian of an extremely eligible orphan, Duke of Holstein, Peter Ulrich, Sophia's second cousin. The 11-year-old Ulrich was destined for a bright future. He was first in line to the Swedish throne, and what's more, he was the only living grandson of Peter the Great of Russia. Sophia describes him at this age as agreeable and well-bred, although having a liking for alcohol. But at this meeting, Sophia struck up conversation with the Duke Ulrich, and this pleased her mother to no end. Sophia, for her part, was excited by the potential match, stating, "I knew that one day he would become King of Sweden, and although I was still a child, the title of Queen fell sweetly on my ears." From that time on, the people around me teased me about him, and gradually I grew accustomed to thinking that I was destined to be his wife. But this meeting wasn't final, and so the presentations to distant relatives and power brokers continued, and through it, the ever-observant Sophia learned something invaluable. She recognised the truth, that people often prefer to talk rather than to listen, and their favourite subject of such talk, it's usually themselves. Her mother, Johanna, always concerned with being seen as important, was also the perfect case study of what not to be. However, in Johanna, for all her faults, there was a cunning machination, and it wasn't just the courts of the lower aristocracy of Germany that Johanna had been courting favour. When Sophia was 12, the daughter of Peter the Great, Elizabeth, had taken the Russian throne in a coup d'etat. Johanna had connections to her. Elizabeth's older sister Anne had married Johanna's cousin, Charles Frederick, the Duke of Holstein. It was this marriage that had produced the young Duke Peter Ulrich. More importantly, the Empress Elizabeth had at one point been engaged to Johanna's older brother, Charles Augustus. Yeah, the nobility of Europe were all intertwined somewhere. Charles Augustus travelled to St. Petersburg for the marriage, but sadly, only weeks before the wedding, he had contracted smallpox and passed away. So it was a bond of grief and shared loss that connected these two families. And upon hearing of Elizabeth becoming Tsarina, Empress of Russia, Johanna began to send letters, which were well received by the Russian Empress. With the benefit of distance, Johanna managed to ingratiate herself with Elizabeth. When Sophia's younger sister was born, Johanna even managed to have the Empress Elizabeth become her godmother. At the same time this relationship was being cultivated, one Peter Ulrich, Duke of Holstein, had vanished from German society and made his reappearance in St. Petersburg. In 1743, his aunt, Tsarina Elizabeth, had chosen him to be her heir. It was on New Year's Day in 1744, while Sophia and her family sat down for New Year's dinner, that a courier arrived with a letter for Johanna. That letter was from the Grand Marshal of the court of Prince Peter Ulrich and contained an instruction from the Empress Elizabeth for Johanna and Sophia to make haste for Russia, with an unspoken but clearly implied statement that the purpose was to arrange a marriage between Sophia and Prince Peter. Not hours had gone by, then a second courier arrived with a shorter message addressed to Johanna from King Frederick of Prussia, and this letter, it all but confirmed that a match had been arranged between Sophia and Peter. The letter also contained a request that Sophia and Johanna visit the court of King Frederick for an audience en route to St. Petersburg. Johanna was ecstatic. She was now to have an audience with two of the most powerful people in Europe. Behind the scenes, Frederick, for his part, was plotting to take down Tsarina Elizabeth's vice-chancellor, a man who was trying to secure an alliance between Russia and Frederick's enemy, Austria. And it was in this context that the young Princess Sophia left her life in the tiny principality of Zerbst, never to return. When Sophia, Johanna and Sophia's father Christian arrived in Berlin, Johanna presented herself to the king without Sophia. When Frederick asked where she was, Johanna made up excuses. Oh, she's sick. The next day, the same excuse. But when Frederick grew suspicious, Johanna said that she didn't have a dress to wear. An exasperated Frederick had his servants grab one of his sister's dresses and instructed Johanna that Sophia be brought before him for dinner. Sophia's initial shyness gave way to bewilderment when she learned that neither her mother or father would be seated with her, and it was made even more shocking by the revelation that she was to be seated next to the king himself. King Frederick was affable and friendly to Sophia, and soon set her at ease with conversation about poetry and plays and the opera. The young Sophia's confidence grew, and she saw that this was an opportunity to show a little bit of her hidden intelligence and wit. She later wrote, "The entire company stared in amazement as the king engaged in conversation with a mere child." And we must remember that children, even princesses in those times, were not thought of as having the capacity to keep pace with the king in conversation. In this line, we can see that Sophia took no shortage of pleasure in the timely revelation of her inner strengths. Frederick, for his part, was mightily impressed. Asking her to pass a dish of jam to another guest, he gave her quite the third-party compliment in the process. Accept this gift from the hand of the loves and graces. And he wasn't just gassing Sophia up either. Frederick wrote to Empress Elizabeth thereafter. The little princess of Zerbst combines the gaiety and spontaneity natural to a child of her age with intelligence and wit surprising in one so young. This was to be the only meeting between King Frederick the Great and the future Catherine the Great, the two figures who would dominate much of Europe for decades. And for our brief glimpse inside that meeting, we can see how the young Sophia displayed a certain wisdom beyond her years of when to show what to people, to control the time, manner and means of expression. In other words, how to play the game. This wisdom would come in handy for all the trials she was set to endure. King Frederick of Prussia, like all good players of the game, had motives in making this marriage beyond merely the diplomatic benefits. Frederick saw in Sophia's mother, Johanna, a potential. Johanna was to be his agent and to exercise influence in the Russian court on his behalf. The chief goal Frederick imparted to Johanna was to do all in her power to undermine Elizabeth's vice-chancellor Betrayal, who was the enemy of Prussia and would surely try and block Sophia's marriage to Grand Duke Peter. Frederick played Johanna like a fiddle. Now she was not only to be merely escorting her daughter to be married to the crown prince, but was to be at the very centre of an intrigue for the ages, the removal of the vice-chancellor of the Russian Empire. It took Sophia and her mother nearly a month to travel to St. Petersburg, and when they finally arrived, Tsarina Elizabeth and Peter had already departed for Moscow. To make Moscow in time for Peter's 16th birthday on the 10th of February, Catherine and her mother departed at once, and they arrived in the court of Elizabeth the night of February the 9th, where Sophia would finally be in the company of Elizabeth and Peter, the two individuals who would control and dictate much of her life for the better part of the next 2 decades. Peter was first to introduce himself, slipping out to see them and declaring that he couldn't wait any longer. In Sophia, Peter saw a German kindred spirit. His time in Russia thus far hadn't been kind to him. His frequent illnesses continued, and the violence that he suffered at the hands of his governor, Otto Brummer, had done a number on his head. He felt incredibly homesick and didn't take a liking to Russian culture. In Peter, Sophia observed the same thin, short and fidgety boy that she had met 5 years earlier. Time had not changed him for the better. Elizabeth, by contrast, was striking, magnificent and dazzling when Sophia finally laid eyes upon her. Sophia later wrote that it was quite impossible not to be astonished by her beauty and the majesty of her being. In the Empress Elizabeth, she saw a model of what she hoped to become. In contrast of Peter, she wrote, "For the first 10 days he seemed glad to see my mother and I, but it became clear that he didn't care for the nation over which he was destined to rule. He was childish. I kept silent and listened, which helped to gain his confidence." Again, on full display is Sophia's calculated silence. As the days wore on, Peter began to speak all too much of what he really thought. He told her, for instance, that he was in love with somebody else, the daughter of a now exiled lady-in-waiting of Elizabeth's. Peter felt the Empress would never permit the marriage, and so he was resigned to marry Sophia, since it's what his auntie wanted. If Sophia was hurt by this, she didn't let it show. Truth be told, she found little to love in him either, but the game had to be played, and since it had to be played, she would play it well. In the weeks that followed, the ever-observant Sophia drew 2 insights. Firstly, that it wasn't Peter she had to please, but the Empress Elizabeth. Secondly, that if her life in Russia was to be successful, she would have to immerse herself in the Russian language, religion and culture. Elizabeth had assigned an Orthodox bishop to teach her in these matters. This man, Simon Todorovsky, quickly gained Sophia's confidence as a teacher and as a man of God. When it came to learning the Russian language, Sophia's perseverance and effort were on full display. She devoted herself day and night to learning Russian, even awakening in the night and walking up and down on the frigid floor with candle and book in hand, reading and memorizing her Russian. However, soon after, Sophia became incredibly sick. She had developed pneumonia, and for weeks her life hung in the balance. The Empress herself helped nurse Sophia, and when Sophia would wake, it was Elizabeth that she would see, who would hold her hand. Then came a moment where everyone thought she might not pull through. Sophia's mother stated that a Lutheran priest should be brought, but Sophia, although very weak, interjected and said, "Why do that? I would rather speak to Todorovsky instead." This news spread like wildfire that Sophia, still ostensibly a Lutheran with only a few weeks in the country, would rather have an Orthodox priest at her bedside while her life hung in the balance. It delighted not only the nobility, but Russians of all stature. Even in her most vulnerable state, Sophia was still playing the game. She would write years later in her memoirs that there were instances where she pretended to be asleep so that she could listen in on the conversations of the nobles in the room, as most of them spoke French. Sophia stating the ladies would speak their mind freely, and in that matter, I learned a great many things. But this illness, it didn't take Sophia, and slowly she managed her recovery. 4 weeks later, she was well enough to present herself at court for her 15th birthday, and although thin as a rake and with her hair falling out, she made her appearance, and in that moment she truly realised what an effect requesting that Orthodox priest had made upon the Russian people. They fawned over her. The look in their eyes, the touch of their hands. She was no longer an outsider. She was Russian. To make it official, Sophia would have to convert religion. The actual process of conversion from Lutheranism to Orthodoxy was a matter that pained Sophia. She had given her father her word that she wouldn't convert, and here only months later she was on the precipice of breaking that promise. And it was breaking a promise that seemed to drive Sophia to tears more than any trepidation about her place in the afterlife. Permission had been sought from Sophia's father for the conversion, and this was eventually obtained at great difficulty through the intercession of King Frederick of Prussia. But while one parent no longer stood in the way of Sophia's ascension, the other parent, through her own hubris, was about to put everything in jeopardy. The Vice-Chancellor Bestuzhev had been secretly intercepting and decoding the letters of both the French and Prussian ambassadors in Russia before having them resealed and sent on their way. The contents of these letters were a total scandal and insulting towards the Empress Elizabeth, calling her fat, lazy and immoral, among other things. Worse still, they betrayed their plot to have the Vice-Chancellor Bestuzhev removed. These letters implicated Johanna, of which the French ambassador had said was in complete agreement with his opinions of Elizabeth. Bestuzhev had been piling these letters up, waiting for the right moment to strike, and he found it when Peter, Sophia, Johanna and Elizabeth went on a retreat to the most important monastery in the Russian Orthodox faith. For Sophia this was to be a flashbulb memory, one that never faded with time. The moment her mother's scheming almost brought her destiny to ruin. Johanna, Sophia and Peter had just finished their lunch when Elizabeth, followed by her physician, the Frenchman Lestock, burst in. Elizabeth demanded Johanna to follow her, and the three of them left the room, with Sophia and Peter climbing up onto the window ledge to watch the happenings outside. The two were laughing and joking when Lestock burst back in, demanding a cessation to their horseplay. Then he turned to Sophia and he told her, "You can pack your bags. You'll be leaving for Germany at once." Peter demanded to know what this was all about, but Lestock only replied coolly that he would find out in time. The irony is that Lestock had been the mastermind of this scheme against Bestuzhev, but his cover hadn't been blown and he was managing to paint himself as the Inquisitor. Peter tried in his own way to comfort Sophia, but she saw a little concern of loss in his eyes. Then Elizabeth re-entered the room, all in a rage, and it was in this moment that Sophia made a move that may have saved her position and her eventual fate. She gave a deep bow to Elizabeth. The act caught the Empress off guard, and she smiled and kissed Sophia on the forehead. Her rage no longer turned in the direction of Sophia. She was safe. There was no chance for reappraisal for the conspirators, however. The French ambassador was kicked out of Russia immediately. The Prussian ambassador managed to hang in for a year before he too was removed. As for Johanna, she was permitted to stay, but only until her daughter's marriage, and she was henceforth persona non grata. Months later, the time for Sophia's conversion to Orthodoxy and her official engagement to Peter had finally arrived. Where formerly the thought of breaking her promise to her father had driven her to tears, now it was the Empress Elizabeth shedding tears, while Sophia remained dignified, stating later that she remained in control. And with this ceremony concluded, she was rechristened Ekaterina, in English, Catherine. The next day, another ceremony, this time in the Assumption Cathedral, beneath the Archbishop of Novgorod. Catherine would become the Grand Duchess of Russia. But for every 2 steps forward that Catherine took towards the mountain summit, there was always 1 step back. 1 step that threatened to become a fall. This time it was Peter. He had contracted smallpox. For 30 days, his life and Catherine's future was up in the air. Courtiers began to ignore her, thinking that she might soon have to return to Germany, a not quite widow. But Peter made his recovery and was brought to see Catherine. There, in the twilight of the day, Catherine saw a man utterly disfigured, later describing him as hideous. Peter asked if she recognised him, to which Catherine could only manage congratulations on his recovery before running back to her quarters and fainting. The Empress was concerned that Catherine might reject the marriage now, and so she invited Catherine to dine with her alone to get a gauge on the situation. What she realised, though, was that Catherine didn't come to Russia to marry for love. Peter, for his part, though, felt humiliated. Already deeply insecure, this only seemed to confirm to him that he was unlovable. This would mark a turning point where Peter began to resent Catherine. He became aloof from her, and she in turn became aloof from him. When she did make an effort to try and connect or to be nice, Peter saw it merely as a show. He saw her success at court, her joie de vivre, and her relative beauty as an affront, and he withdrew further, regressing to his childhood fascination with military drills and parade, dressing his servants up in German military uniforms and parading them back and forth from the comfort of his bedchambers. Catherine couldn't stomach it. It was under these circumstances that the Empress Elizabeth began to hurry the process. The point of their marriage was to produce an heir, and with Peter's tenuous mental well-being and poor physical health, it was time to get making hay while the sun still shone. And so the marriage date was set. As the wedding got closer, though, Peter's behaviour was becoming more cavalier. Catherine writes, "I saw clear as day that the Grand Duke's retinue, and even his tutors, had lost all authority over him. His military games, which had been kept a secret, now went on in their presence. He spent his private time entirely in the company of servants, engaging in childish pursuits, not becoming of somebody of his age. He even played with dolls. Peter found great amusement in instructing me in military exercises, and due to him, I can handle a rifle with the precision of an experienced soldier. He made me stand at arms with my musket, on duty at the door between his room and my own." But this was only just scratching the surface of Peter's shenanigans. And as Catherine's wedding day approached, she had an implicit understanding that she had a sour marriage to look forward to and an uncertain future. She writes, "As my wedding day came nearer, I became melancholy. I would often cry without knowing why. My heart imagined little happiness. It was ambition alone that sustained me. In my innermost soul there was something that never, not for a single moment, allowed me to doubt that I would eventually become the sovereign Empress of Russia in my own right." What a fascinating passage. If this isn't a case of hindsight bias, it's remarkable that we get such a window into how driven Catherine was, and how her ambition steeled her against the prospect of becoming a prisoner to the whims of an unstable man-child. On August 21st, 1745, the big day finally arrived. Catherine was awoken at 6 in the morning, and the long, slow process of turning this human being into an animate ball of jewels and precious metals began. It took many hours. She was so weighed down by it all that Catherine found it hard to even move. But finally, the Empress Elizabeth placed the diamond crown of the Grand Duchess upon her head. At noon, Peter arrived, himself also laden with finery befitting a future Tsar, and the two departed with Empress Elizabeth on a coach that was described as a little castle, drawn by 8 pure white horses. They finally arrived at the cathedral for a service that lasted 3 hours and was described by Catherine as an endurance ordeal. For one thing, the crown was so heavy that it began to cause her a severe headache. After the ceremony came the banquet and then the ball. Now at the banquet, the crown atop Catherine's head had become so unbearable that she asked Elizabeth if it might be removed for a few minutes, and Elizabeth relented. This shows that Catherine, for all her stoic endurance, did have her limits to the observation of protocol. And then came the ball. Fortunately, After only half an hour of dancing, Elizabeth had the entire ordeal cut short and had Peter and Catherine escorted to their apartment along with the bridesmaids and bridegroom. Here the men and women separated, and Catherine was helped from her outfit and placed on the bed to await her husband. But there for hours she waited alone, not knowing what to do. Eventually, in the small hours of the morning, Peter stumbled in, drunk as a skunk, and collapsed into bed. And he let out an awkward laugh and stated, "Oh, how it would amuse my servants to see us in bed together." And then he fell asleep. The next morning, Catherine's new chief lady-in-waiting asked whether they had consummated, and Catherine remained quiet. She didn't know what to do. The next night was the same, and as Catherine writes, things remained this way without even the slightest change for the following 9 years. This new lady-in-waiting, Madame Kraus, was an imposing figure and had struck fear into Catherine's other ladies-in-waiting. These ladies, usually a source of emotional support and friendship for Catherine, had been commanded not to speak to her at any length. This must have been an ill omen for Catherine. Stripping her of her emotional support of her retinue might have been a play from Elizabeth to force her into the arms of Peter, but it would be yet another wound that Catherine would simply have to endure. Peter, for his part, continued to ignore Catherine, and as she writes, would spend all of his time playing soldier in his room with his servants. Throughout this period, I had nobody to speak to. Catherine was ostracised in her gilded cage. Now when Peter finally did speak to her, it was to tell her that he had fallen in love with one of the ladies-in-waiting of the Empress, a confession he also shared with his chamberlain. Now this might have been yet another twist of the knife on Peter's part, but it might also have been a rationalisation for his lack of interest in his wife. Catherine, rather candidly in later decades, wrote of this moment, "I would have been ready to love him had he been capable of affection, or at least a show of it. But from the first days of our marriage, the sad conclusion was evident. I told myself, if you are to allow yourself to love that man, you will be the unhappiest person on earth. With your temperament, you will expect some response. This man scarcely looks at you, talks of nothing but dolls, and pays more attention to any other woman than yourself. You are too proud to complain. Therefore, attention please, and keep on a leash any affection you might feel for this gentleman. You have yourself to think about, my dear girl." This first scar made upon my impressionable heart remained with me forever. Never did this firm resolution leave my head. But I took good care not to tell anybody that I had the resolve never to love without restraint a man who would not return this love in full. Such was my disposition that my heart would have belonged entirely and without reserve to a husband who only loved me. In this passage, we can glean great insight into how Catherine dealt with the emotional trauma of that situation, with courage, with intellect, not allowing her emotions to overcome her, but trying to keep as even a keel as possible through the storm that surrounded her. Now it was at this time that Catherine began to seek a reconciliation with her mother. The relationship had been strained for a time, but now with few others to even speak with, Catherine took every opportunity to call upon her mother and to reminisce. But soon even this would be stolen from her, as the Empress held true to her dictation that Johanna was to leave Russia following the marriage. For her role in the plot against Bestuzhev, Elizabeth had one final punishment. It was Johanna who was to deliver the news to Frederick the Great that his ambassador of 20 years in Russia, Baron Mardefeld, was to be sent back to Prussia at once. Frederick, furious at the overestimation of Johanna, sought to punish her in due course. Putting his revenge on the back burner, he waited 10 years until Johanna's husband, Catherine's father, had died, and then as she was serving as regent of Zerbst, he had the small principality annexed into Prussia. and Johanna was exiled. She was forced to live in the margins of society in Paris and passed away there only a mere 2 years before the gripping climax of our story for today. Catherine would never see her mother or father again in her life. How would that make you feel? We can infer how Catherine felt. She had a big heart, a heart that she had built a wall around, but a big heart nonetheless. Catherine wrote of her mother's departure. In that time, I would have given much, if only I could have left the country with her. With her mother gone and Catherine isolated, she sought to have old friends return to her circle, but every attempt was headed off at the pass by Betrayal and Elizabeth. Betrayal, for his part, wanted to keep Catherine and Peter isolated so that they wouldn't challenge his power, and Elizabeth, for her part, was also keenly aware of how she herself had come to power in a coup d'etat, and so keeping them somewhat isolated gave her a peace of mind. Additionally, when Catherine and Peter were her adopted heirs, their duty was to produce an heir of their own, a task which they hadn't done. So distractions were to be kept to a minimum. Catherine was even forbidden from sending or receiving letters. While Catherine was outwardly demure towards the Empress, Peter was growing incautious and rebellious. In one of his rooms, he had boarded up a door that led to Elizabeth's private dining room. Peter had set up a puppet show and was entertaining his servants with the affair when he heard conversation coming through the boarded door. Curiosity got the best of him, and he took a carpenter's bore and drilled holes through the door so that he could peep through. Not satisfied with his own indiscretion, he drilled some more holes and invited his servants to partake in the hijinks. Then he went and got Catherine and told her to look through the door. Catherine was shocked and said she wanted no part of this, and that the Empress would surely be upset if she learned of it. And learn of it she did. One Sunday morning following Mass, she stormed into Catherine and Peter's apartment and hurled insults at Peter. It was with such a fury that even Catherine began to cry. Turning to her, Elizabeth said, "My comments are not directed at you." And then, calming down, Elizabeth departed. Madame Krause, a witness to this, stated, "She scolded you like a mother, but then it blew over. You should have both said to her, 'We beg your pardon, mother,' and that would have disarmed her." Catherine would never forget this incident, and in many future occasions where Elizabeth's wrath surfaced, she would employ this line to great effect. Now, as time progressed and no heir was in the oven, so to speak, Elizabeth grew more and more impatient. Betrayal, for his part, ever suspicious of Prussian influence, reckoned Catherine might have been influenced by her mother and by proxy Frederick to remain celibate. He had a governess installed upon Catherine, Maria Choglikova, who was soon followed in quick order by her husband to watch over Peter. They were an arrogant and authoritarian couple who were to act as the eyes and ears of Betrayal, and more importantly, to act, in effect, as Catherine and Peter's jailers. Now, as the months and years drew by, they would impose more and more restrictions upon Catherine and Peter, to the point where even Madame Krause switched allegiances and began to aid the young Duke and Duchess in whatever means she still had in her power. Yet still, with little to do, the couple didn't consummate their marriage. Elizabeth, at her wit's end, began to think that it was Catherine who was responsible for this. One day, she barreled Catherine up against a wall and hurled insults at her, accusing her of being an agent, of not loving her husband, of failing in her duties. All Catherine could do was cry, but this only made the torrent from Elizabeth worse, telling her that she was now too old for tears and was forbidden from them. Then Catherine remembered those words. "I beg your pardon, mother." And just as Madame Krause had said, Elizabeth's temper abated. These incidents would continue on and off, and Peter and Catherine would continue to live under the boot of the Choglikovs. But she did have her escapes. The first was horse riding, the second were balls, and the third, and most important, were books. Catherine read voraciously anything that she could get her hands upon. Histories, philosophers, theorists. In September 1751, perhaps in an attempt to surround Peter by more worldly men, Elizabeth assigned him 3 new gentlemen in waiting. This was to be a pivotal moment in Catherine's life. One of these men, Sergei Saltykov, had made seduction his overarching striving in life. He had been married for 2 years, a marriage on a whim and fancy, and he was ready to move on. Quickly, it was Catherine who became his object of affection. The 3 gentlemen in waiting devised clever plans to waylay both the Choglakovs and Peter, and through this, Sergei Saltykov was able to steal more than a few private conversations with Catherine, and although Catherine rebuffed him, he was persistent and handsome, and she soon began to fall for Saltykov. Despite her growing infatuations with him, she was racked by troubles, the least of which was what would happen to her if such an affair became known. But as passion is wont to do in someone starved of affection for so long, it eventually overcame her concerns. The affair would carry on for some time. Peter learned of it in due course, but didn't seem to mind being cuckolded. If anything, he took pleasure in the fact that the Choglakovs were being played like a fiddle by his new gentleman-in-waiting. With an emotional outlet for her troubles, Catherine began to worry less about certain appearances, and no longer tried to hide her love of riding horses astride from the Empress, who, for some reason, had this idea that riding horses astride would result in a barren womb. The Empress and Madame Choglakova witnessed this one day, and the Empress stated that this was probably the cause for her failure to bear children. Choglakova responded that children could not appear without something happening first. The Empress then made it clear that it wasn't only the Duke and Duchess that had failed in their duty. The implication was clear: put up or shove off. Madame Choglakova, for all her deficiencies as a human being, decided something drastic needed to be done, and after a conference with one of Peter's valets, it was decided to force a more experienced but kindly woman upon Peter. And in this venture, Choglakova achieved a great success. As for the other side of things, Madame Choglakova had a frank conversation with Catherine and said that she was to take one of Peter's gentlemen-in-waiting as a lover. Catherine observed that a change had taken place in Madame Choglakova, a softening of this once dictatorial woman, and there was an opportunity here for a change of dynamic. As for Catherine, she soon fell pregnant. Convenient timing. Only months thereafter, though, she miscarried. Saltykov, for his part, had grown more distant, and when she pressed him, he offered only that there was a need for caution. His position was not secure, and this was a great risk to him, if only he had an ally of greater power. He suggested Catherine reach out to Bestuzhev to help him advance his career, and Catherine was incredibly apprehensive about this. This was the man who had tried so hard to make her life hell, but nevertheless she agreed. Catherine first requested a messenger be sent with a few words for Bestuzhev, overtures that, as Catherine states, were intended to allow him to believe that she was less hostile towards him than before. The now Chancellor's reaction couldn't have been any better. He was delighted, as her words came at a time when his power base was on shaky grounds. Elizabeth had a new favourite, and this favourite was plotting against Bestuzhev's diplomatic strategy. He asked Catherine if she had a safe channel through which they could communicate. Now naturally, Saltykov was the man for the job. Saltykov and Bestuzhev's meeting went incredibly well, and he indeed made commitments to help Saltykov's career. Then of Catherine he said, "I am going to do a little service for which she will thank me. She will be able to do as she pleases from now on. Catherine will see that I am not the ogre that she thinks I am." By luck or by careful movement, Catherine had managed to turn one of her greatest enemies into a supporter. Bestuzhev, for his part, had come to realise something. While Peter had a much greater love of Holstein than of Russia, Catherine, on the other hand, was sympathetic to Russian interests and far more intelligent than her husband. She could prove a valuable ally. It was around this time that Catherine was able to cement a change in the Choglakova situation. It turned out that Madame Choglakova had been carrying on an affair with a certain prince, and she felt the need to confide in someone. She chose Catherine. We can infer from this again Catherine's ability over time to draw the trust of even those she had icy relationships with. Soon enough, Nicholas Choglakov, her husband, had begun to suspect his wife was having an affair, and although sick and in bed, he summoned Catherine to confront her about it. Catherine feigned ignorance, but just then his wife walked in, and the situation devolves into a shouting match. He accuses her, and under the heat of examination, she throws it back in his face. Yes, she had been carrying on an affair, but it was his fault. She had been far too kind for him over the years, particularly in light of his own infidelity and cheating. Both parties tried to get Catherine to take a side, but she remained aloof, ever careful not to tie herself too strongly to a side when it wasn't necessary. This incident would do nothing for Nicholas's health, and soon his sickness worsened. Within weeks he would pass away, and in the eyes of the Empress Elizabeth, the court of the Grand Duchess and Duke was no place for a widow. So it was the Choglakovs' reign over Catherine and Peter came to an end. Now over this period, Catherine had fallen pregnant again. This time she would carry to term. And while in her first draft of her memoirs she makes allusions to the fact that the father was Saltykov, and supposedly in later years had these rumours spread about that her son was a bastard child, we can still infer that at the time both Saltykov and Catherine had good reason to ensure the waters were muddied, and that Peter's parentage was plausible, not only to Elizabeth, but also to Peter. Additionally, the timing of the son's birth aligns with the conception period around the New Year celebrations, which, Catherine states in her own diaries, were spent with Elizabeth and Peter, meaning Saltykov could have been nowhere near at hand. There's a reasonable amount of evidence that the child was likely Peter's. So it was then, on September the 20th, 1754, Catherine gave birth to her first child, Paul. No sooner had the baby been bathed than Elizabeth and the midwife had the baby snatched up and taken away. Peter, showing little interest, got up and left. This left Catherine alone, with only her chief lady in waiting, Madame Vladislavova. Catherine was exhausted. The labour had not been an easy one, and she asked Madame Vladislavova to help lift her out of her labour bed and place her in a fresh one. To this the petrified madam responded that she dared not move her without permission of the midwife. When Catherine asked for water, she got the same response. And so she lay there until hours later they managed to track down the midwife, who finally got Catherine the water and a clean bed. But this event was far from being a happy one, and it left an indelible mark on Catherine. She was denied her opportunity to bond with her newborn son. She wasn't even allowed to see him for a whole week. Many scholars have argued that this was the cause of a strained and distant relationship between Catherine and her son as he grew up. A relationship that was never very warm. Then again, Catherine was never shown much love by her own mother. That might hold just as much weight for explaining Catherine's lack of maternal warmth. Worse still, while Catherine languished in bed recovering, she learned that Saltykov had been assigned a mission to go and spread the word of Paul's birth to the royal court in Sweden. Catherine wrote, "This meant I was to be separated at a time from the one person I cared about the most. I buried myself in my bed, where I did nothing but grieve. I pretended to have pains that prevented me from getting up, but in all honesty, I just couldn't bear to be in the company of anyone. Such was my state of sorrow." This was yet another trauma that piled up for Catherine, and for quite a while it kept her in a depression. She spent the entire winter cloistered away in a small, cold room. And it was during this period that she discovered Tacitus and his histories of Rome. Now in these histories, Catherine saw the obvious similarities between Rome and the society that she now lived in. Through Tacitus, she became aware of an idea that, as Catherine puts it, that people do not always act according to the ideological reasons they profess, and she surmised that she would do well to look for the hidden personal motives behind their actions. Catherine then read Montesquieu and his criticisms of despotism. Next it was Voltaire, and she became inspired by these Enlightenment values of the liberty of man and of hedonistic virtue. But most importantly, she found a way to reconcile the despotism inherent in the Russian Empire with that of the Enlightenment virtue of reason. An enlightened despotism. These writers were to have a profound effect on Catherine and would shape the way that she would eventually lead her nation. Adding to Catherine's woes, however, when Saltykov finally returned months later, his passion and interest in her had not returned with him, and his return was momentary, for he had been posted to Hamburg as a permanent ambassador. When they finally met, he had words of appeasement for her, but Catherine knew the score. It was the last time they would meet. Catherine was now at a crossroads. She had done her duty. She had produced an heir, and now she was forgotten. Catherine had found her resolve, however. Emerging from her depression, she realised something. She was now the mother of the future emperor. And if the lack of an heir had made her future contingent and uncertain, it was now to some degree secure. This meant she no longer had to rely as strongly on pleasing Peter, or indeed the Empress. And so Catherine set her target on the Empress's new favourites, the Shuvalovs. This family had risen to become the preeminent family in Russia at this time, owing to the young Ivan Shuvalov's relationship with the ageing Empress. They had accrued many enemies on their rise to power, though, and Catherine made no bones about speaking her mind about them. According to her, the Shuvalovs were stupid and malicious, and taking every opportunity to disparage them, Catherine aligned herself with those that opposed their influence. The Shuvalovs, caught off guard, decided to turn to Peter as an ally. Peter tried to discipline Catherine, even drawing his sword on her, to which Catherine responded, "Well, if we are to duel, is it not only honourable that I too have a sword?" The drunken Peter was at a loss for words, and Catherine kindly suggested he go to bed. Here we see Catherine gaining in assertiveness. What at first seemed like loneliness had been reframed as room to manoeuvre. Now Catherine wasn't the only one growing bolder, though. Peter now had decided that he was going to bring a Holstein detachment to Russia. This occurred at a time when tensions were very high between Russia and Prussia, and anti-German sentiment in general was through the roof. Peter had managed to conceal the size of this force from both Catherine and the Empress. And when Catherine finally did learn about it, she knew that it would have a bad effect on Russian public opinion, and for that matter Elizabeth. When the entire battalion arrived at the palace of Oranienbaum, Catherine was there to see Alexander Shuvalov's face twitch in fury and frustration. The Russian infantry guarding the palace saw these soldiers as puppets of Frederick the Great. Nobility in St. Petersburg saw it either as a scandal or a farce. Catherine thought it to be a freakish prank, and a perilous one at that. But perhaps she also saw the beginnings of an opportunity. It weakened public opinion of both the Shuvalovs and of Peter. Peter, for his part, threw himself into the venture, where before he would only sneak on his Holstein uniform in private. Now he wore it nearly constantly, and spent almost all of his time with his battalion, engaging them in military drills, graduating from wooden toys to human ones. The rot really set in when it became clear that Russian soldiers would have to feed these German soldiers, and the complaints began to ring out that the Russian soldiers were being employed as servants to the Germans. Within a year, the majority of these soldiers would be quietly sent home. But Elizabeth's opinion of Peter, low as it was never to recover. Soon Catherine found herself a new lover in the young Pole, Count Stanislaw Poniatowski, a good, honest man, which just made Peter's increasingly bizarre behaviour even more prominent to her. As winter set in, Peter had been forced to replace his obsession with drilling actual men with drilling his toys again. He had filled a room with tables of toy soldiers along with papier-mâché fortresses. Every morning, he and his servants in full Holstein uniform would preside over a changing of the guard, where some of the toy soldiers would be relieved of duty and replaced by others. One morning, Catherine walked in to find a rat strung from a model gallows. Disgusted, she demanded an explanation. The rat, Peter explained, had been court-martialed for the crimes of breaching the ramparts of the cardboard fortress and eating 2 papier-mâché sentries. His crimes merited the ultimate punishment, and now the rat would remain exposed to the public for a period of 3 days to set an example. Catherine couldn't contain her laughter at this completely absurd situation, but Peter began to sulk, and before walking off, Catherine delivered some of her biting wit, stating that the rat was given no opportunity to defend itself, and that it was hardly just to execute without a fair trial. In the months that followed, Catherine soon fell pregnant again. This time, there was no confusion. Peter was not the father, and he knew it. For some time, Catherine had been managing Peter's responsibilities of state, and as the months wore on and the pregnancy progressed, she was no longer capable of attending functions on his behalf. Now this annoyed Peter to no end, and he exclaimed one day to a mutual friend, "I don't know where she keeps getting these pregnancies from, because it certainly isn't from me." This friend immediately reported this to Catherine, and Catherine, sensing the danger that could come from Peter's words, decided on a bold strategy. She would call his bluff. She instructed the friend to return to Peter and tell him that if he felt the child was not his, then he should make that claim official to the Empress at once, or keep his thoughts to himself. Peter, fearing the consequences to himself also, relented. This reveals that Catherine was willing to make calculated gambles based on the knowledge of the character of the person she was opposing. On the home front, Catherine's pregnancy was a success, and she gave birth to a baby girl. This time, she had already steeled herself for what would happen, and so when the baby was again stolen from her to be raised by the Empress, it didn't depress her in the same manner as Paul's birth. Now, beyond the court of Catherine and Peter, world affairs were quickly moving the ground beneath them. Russia was allied to both Austria and France against Prussia. Tensions in Europe were at their zenith. Prussia had recently secured an alliance with Great Britain, a move which took both Bestuzhev and Catherine off guard. Both had considerable ties with the English ambassador, who was now secretly acting as King Frederick of Prussia's informant. King Frederick and Prussia, sensing that war was inevitable, struck first by invading Saxony to the south. Russia was now bound to war with Prussia, and both Catherine and Peter in their own ways suffered setbacks as a result. Quickly, an army had been prepared with orders to march on East Prussia. The field marshal appointed was Stepan Apraxin, a favourite of Bestuzhev. Apraxin was a careful man, if only of moderate military acumen, and he was worried about two things. Firstly, he wasn't confident of winter offensives. Secondly, Elizabeth's health was faltering. He knew Peter, her heir, would not persist in a war against Prussia. When Apraxin's army beat the Prussians at the Battle of Gross-Jagersdorf, St. Petersburg was alight with celebrations. Surely he would now march on Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia. The way stood open. However, Apraxin dithered for a fortnight before making his advance, and then, inexplicably to those in Petersburg, he retreated in what appeared to be an unorganised and unforced rout. Elizabeth, though ill, was absolutely furious, and it provided the Shuvalov faction and the Vice-Chancellor Vorontsov an opportunity to strike. Apraxin was stripped of his command and imprisoned. Bestuzhev was stripped of his chancellorship soon afterwards, and was banished to his country estate. Empress would never get the opportunity to explain that smallpox had ripped through the Russian army, or that Prussian farmers had scorched their earth, and that the Russians had vastly underestimated their supplies, with their horses dying by the hundreds. Empress would depart this world under mysterious circumstances while in prison. Catherine was implicated in this entire affair. The Shuvalovs showed Elizabeth letters that had been recovered between Catherine and Empress, of whom she was friendly. Now, although these letters didn't contain any betrayals, they asked Elizabeth why the Grand Duchess was interfering in matters of the state, and if these letters had been recovered, who was to say whether more incriminating letters had not already been burned? Significantly, Bestezev had indeed managed to burn a draft proposal that on the passing of Elizabeth, Catherine should co-rule with Peter. Thus Catherine escaped the worst of suspicion. Elizabeth, however, seeking to curtail Catherine's growing power, made a declaration that she wasn't to involve herself in Peter's affairs any further, and that Peter was to assert himself over his wife. Furthermore, Alexander Shuvalov was to take a leading role in keeping tabs over all of Catherine's affairs. Out of an abundance of caution, Catherine called her valet to gather all of the papers, letters, and documents that she had received or written. Then she burned them all. Catherine turned to her valet and said, "You are witness to this burning. If you are ever asked where these documents have got to, you will be able to swear that you saw me burn them," thus sparing her valet involvement in any conspiracy, imagined or otherwise. This incident shows both Catherine's precautious wisdom, but also her humanity. A mere valet could easily be put to interrogation, exile, or worse. And she had spared him that fate, even to her own disadvantage. Catherine wasn't done making moves though. She was about to make one hell of a gamble. She decided she was going to go to the court theatre to attend a Russian play. There was talk that Elizabeth might be in attendance. Catherine knew Peter would kick up a stink. He hated Russian theatre and didn't even like the mention of it in her presence. Moreover, Catherine's ladies-in-waiting would be forced to attend with her, and Peter didn't want to be deprived of an evening with Lady Vorontsova, whom he'd grown quite attracted to. Catherine sent word for Alexander Shuvalov to send for a carriage. Shuvalov came in and stated that Peter would prohibit a carriage. Catherine retorted that since she was ostracised from her husband's society, it wouldn't matter whether she was in her own room or at the theatre. But no sooner had Shuvalov departed the room than Peter burst in, all a rage, accusing Catherine of provoking him for the sake of pleasure. Catherine responded coolly that if he forbid a carriage, she would walk, and if her ladies-in-waiting were prevented from coming, she would walk alone. But this was only the beginning. She stated that she would write and complain to the Empress. "Oh, and what will you say to her?" Shuvalov responded assertively. "I will inform her that in order to arrange for my husband a rendezvous with my maids of honour, you have encouraged him to prevent me from going to the theatre where I might have had the pleasure of seeing Her Imperial Majesty. Moreover, I will beg her to send me home, because I am tired of and disgusted by the role that I am made to play here, alone and neglected in my room, hated by the Grand Duke and disliked by the Empress. I do not want to be a burden to anyone any longer, or to bring any misfortune to whomever approaches me, especially my poor servants, many of whom have already been exiled because I have been good to them. I am going to write to Her Majesty this instant, and I will see whether you can avoid taking this letter to her." It's hard not to admire Catherine's power play towards Shuvalov here. She was willing to risk everything here to achieve her aims, like many of the great people of history before her. Shuvalov left to arrange the carriage, and Catherine began writing. The letter thanks Elizabeth for all of her kindnesses, Catherine said that events had indicated that she didn't deserve Elizabeth's favour, since she had only incurred Peter's hatred and Elizabeth's displeasure. Given these failures on Catherine's part, she humbly asked the Empress to put her out of her misery and grant her permission to return home to her family in Zerbst, in whatever capacity the Empress deemed appropriate. On the matter of her children, Catherine wrote that since she was never allowed to see them, it wouldn't matter if she was hundreds of feet away or hundreds of miles. Besides, Elizabeth could care for them better than Catherine could ever imagine to. As for Catherine, she would spend the rest of her life praying for Elizabeth, Peter, and her children. But that her sadness had wounded her to such an extent that she had to concentrate on preserving her own life. And so she begged of Elizabeth that she might be released, first to recover and then to depart back to Zerbst. Handing this letter to Shuvalov when he returned, she told him that any lady who wished to be excused was welcome to remain, and as Catherine and her reduced entourage left, Peter, for the first time in his life, rose from his seat for her, and she responded with a curtsy and departed for the play. Elizabeth didn't attend the play that evening, but when Catherine returned, Shuvalov stated that the Empress had read her letter and had agreed in principle to an interview at the time of her choosing. While this was a huge gamble, it was a calculated risk. Catherine knew that if the Shuvalovs wanted to have her sent away or to intimidate her through the risk of it, the best way to combat them was to suggest it herself. Of course, she didn't want to go. Half of her life had been in Russia with the aim of becoming Tsarina. But Catherine also knew that succession was front and centre of Elizabeth's mind, and while the nameless prisoner number one, the child Tsar Ivan IV, still lived, the same Tsar Elizabeth had deposed in a coup, she would likely not want to risk losing the most level-headed member of the royal family. One day, weeks later, the interview finally came. After midnight, Catherine was escorted to the Empress's apartment. But it wasn't only Elizabeth that greeted her eyes, but Peter and Ivan Shuvalov as well. Catherine approached the monarch and fell to her knees and begged her to be sent home. Elizabeth seemed saddened rather than enraged and asked, "What of your children?" Catherine repeated her line that they would be better off left in Elizabeth's care in any case. Next, Elizabeth asked how it would be explained to the people. Catherine responded that Elizabeth, as she saw fit, could explain all of the reasons that Catherine had brought upon herself the displeasure of the Empress and of the Grand Duke. "But how will you manage?" Elizabeth asked. "I will do as I did before you gave me the honour of choosing me," Catherine responded. The Empress instructed Catherine to rise, which she did. Elizabeth then began to pace the room. Eventually, she approached and said, "As God is my witness, you would not know how I cried for you when you were so ill when you arrived here in Russia. If I did not love you, I would not have kept you." Catherine responded with gratitude. But this caused a shift in the Empress's mood. She started rattling off her list of grievances. "You are so terribly haughty. You imagine that there is nobody as clever as you." Catherine responded with a careful and earnest reply. "If I ever had such conceit, madam, nothing would be more likely to divest me of that than my situation and this conversation." As the Empress and Catherine were speaking, they both noticed Peter whispering in the ear of Shuvalov. Elizabeth approached the pair and began speaking with them. Catherine couldn't hear a word until Peter raised his voice and shouted, "She is dreadfully spiteful and very obstinate." Catherine retorted, "If you are speaking of me, I am glad to tell you in the presence of Her Imperial Majesty that I am indeed spiteful to people who advise you to inflict injustice." Peter, getting no traction from Catherine, turned to Elizabeth. "You can see how malicious she is by what she's saying." While Catherine observed that Elizabeth had been advised to give no quarter to Catherine, she was beginning to soften, and Catherine's words were having their effect. Elizabeth continued with her criticisms though. "You meddled in many things that didn't concern you. For instance, how could you have been so presumptuous as to send orders to General Empress?" Catherine responded that she had never ordered him, Elizabeth said, "The letters are right there," pointing to a basin. "How can you deny it? You were forbidden to write." Catherine regathered. "It's true that I erred in this respect, and I beg your Majesty's forgiveness. But as for the letters, they speak for themselves. In one I told him what was being said of him and begged him to follow your orders, your Majesty. The other two only contained congratulations on the birth of his son and New Year's greetings." "Bestuzev says there are many others," Elizabeth continued the line of interrogation. "Bestuzev lies," Catherine spoke confidently. "Well then, I guess we shall have to have him put to the whip," the Empress replied. Catherine said that she could do as she saw fit, but that no more than 3 letters had been written. The Empress continued her pacing, speaking in turn with Catherine and then Peter and then Shuvalov. Peter continued to protest, trying to arouse anger in Elizabeth towards Catherine, but in Catherine's own words, as he went about this stupidly and displayed more passion than justice, he failed. She listened with a kind of involuntary approval to my responses. His behaviour became so objectionable that the Empress came up to me and said in a low voice, "I have many more things to say to you, but I do not want to make things worse between the two of you than they already are." To which Catherine responded, "And I too find it difficult to speak, in spite of my great desire to tell you all that is on my heart and in my mind." Elizabeth gave her an understanding nod, and then dismissed both Catherine and Peter. Shuvalov then appeared at Catherine's door within the hour, just as she was getting ready for bed. In Catherine's memoirs she writes, "He told me that the Empress had spoken to him at length, and had instructed him to tell me not to worry over much, that she would have another conversation with me alone, and soon." Catherine gave Shuvalov a curtsy, and as Shuvalov went to leave, he impressed upon Catherine the need for absolute secrecy in this matter. Peter wasn't to know. Catherine now knew that her grand gamble had paid off. She, through agitating the court and bringing matters to a head, created the opportunity to clear her name and repair the relationship between the Empress and herself. True to her word, Elizabeth sent Catherine a message several weeks later, which instructed her to come and see her children, and that afterwards Catherine would have a private conversation with the Empress. True to her word, when Catherine met Elizabeth, she was alone. Elizabeth made Catherine promise to answer all of her questions truthfully, which Catherine did. Elizabeth asked again if there were only 3 letters, and Catherine swore to it. Then Catherine concludes. She asked for all the details on Peter's mode of living. Strangely, at the height of this intrigue, this is where Catherine's personal memoirs conclude. But we can surmise here from the remaining years of Elizabeth's reign that Catherine didn't lose her cool here in this moment. She did not overplay her hand, and she regained the Empress's favour. Peter wasn't done though. Although he had never been really upset at being cuckolded by Catherine's affairs, the power imbalance between them upset him. His relationship with Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Elizabeth Vorontsova, the sister of the now chancellor, was no secret. Catherine, however, had managed to keep her relationship with Poniatowski, on the other hand, quite the secret. Of course, it was no secret that she carried a flame for him. Poniatowski had been caught up in the Bestuzev affair, where he had been initially sent away from Russia due to suspicions about sympathies for Frederick the Great. Catherine had managed to have him recalled to Russia through Bestuzev's intercession, but with Bestuzev now disgraced, he was told to return to his native Poland. Poniatowski could only delay his departure for so long, but unfortunately, during one of his final visits to Catherine, he was caught in the act, and through some rather impressive cunning, Vorontsova and Peter managed to make the affair known to all. The affair itself, Peter and Vorontsova weren't really concerned with. They cheerfully encouraged Poniatowski and Catherine, Peter bringing them in to play a game of cards before declaring late one night, "Well, my children, you do not need of me any more, I think," and taking Vorontsova by the hand departing to his own room. However, the affair became a scandal in the Russian court, and Elizabeth quickly had Poniatowski packed up and returned to Poland. Peter had reasserted himself. By 1758, the Empress Elizabeth's health was failing. Peter had begun making overtures that once Tsar, he would divorce Catherine and marry Vorontsova. Catherine, if she was going to win this game, would need allies. Bestuzhev was still in disgrace. Poniatowski was back in Poland. Now, while she had sympathies in court from the Bestuzhev faction, they were keeping quiet so as not to arouse suspicion. Catherine needed new allies. The first would come in the form of Count Nikita Panin. He was a protege of Bestuzhev and had escaped the purge in virtue of being the Russian ambassador in Sweden. He was liberal-minded, adept, and cultured. Following his mentor, he was also anti-Prussian, and thus was anti-Peter. When he refused to adopt the new dictates of the Shuvalov faction, he resigned from his post as ambassador to Sweden and was recalled to Russia. Here, though, Elizabeth recognised his talents and kept him safe from the Shuvalovs. Instead, Elizabeth had him become the young Duke Paul's chamberlain and chief tutor. This gave Panin shelter, but also a keen interest in the game of succession. Peter hated the man and stated that as soon as he was Tsar, he was going to arrange a more appropriate military education for his son. Panin felt that Peter was unfit to rule and wanted to install Paul as Tsar, with Catherine as regent. Catherine strung him along, telling him, "I would rather be mother to a Tsar than a wife." Beyond this statement, however, the two made no plans. Catherine was careful not to commit herself, and of course, she had far greater plans in mind. The next ally Catherine secured for herself was one Gregory Orlov. Orlov was to be at the centre of our story's climax today. By 1758, the war wasn't going well for Frederick the Great. He was surrounded by France, Austria and Russia, all opposing him. At the Battle of Zorndorf, Frederick lost a third of his army to Russian forces, but dealt just as much if not more himself. The battle was fought to a standstill, but from this battle, Russia managed to capture Frederick's personal adjutant, Count Kurt von Schwerin, and so a Russian officer would be needed to accompany him back to Russia. Chosen for this task was none other than the war hero Gregory Orlov. Wounded thrice in battle, he was a strong leader and displayed great courage. Now, this was his reward. He was as much Count Schwerin's aide-de-camp as he was his guard and jailer. And once they reached Russia, Peter, ever fawning over the Prussians, met with Schwerin and declared that he was to be treated with all of the honours and freedom extended to prominent allies, stating to Schwerin that, "If I were emperor, you would not be a prisoner here at all." Peter would frequently dine with Schwerin, and as a result, Orlov came within Catherine's extended orbit. By 1761, the two of them were engaged in an affair that would bear Catherine her third child. While Catherine kept this affair with the utmost secrecy, with neither Peter nor Catherine's friends even aware of it, Orlov could not help but tell his 5 brothers, who were also prominent in the military officer caste. Far from being scandalised, as the rumours spread among the officer class, it was mostly with approval. Catherine had begun to win over the officer caste, and along with her relationship with Orlov, she carefully cultivated a friendship with the wife of a well-liked guardsman. Catherine was also beginning to win over the guards themselves. With Elizabeth's health continuing to decline, Peter was becoming more and more arrogant and bold in his sympathy for Prussia, and along with it, his hatred of all things Russian. Sure of his succession to the throne, he began openly proclaiming that once he was emperor, he would make peace with Prussia and then switch sides and join Frederick. After that, he intended to put Russia to war against Denmark so that he could recover territory that Denmark had taken from Holstein in 1721. Of equal scandal, he declared that he would divorce Catherine and marry Elizabeth Vorontsova. Peter was doing everything in his power to aid Frederick. He was spying for Frederick, informing him of the goings-on at Elizabeth's war council. This information would be passed through the English ambassador, Sir Robert Keith. Keith would then have his documents sent to the English ambassador in Berlin, where they were copied and given to Frederick. Thus Frederick often knew what Russia's moves were before they even made them. But Peter wasn't really adept at matters of secrecy, and he was pretty terrible at concealing his moves. And thus both the French and Austrian ambassadors complained of this behaviour to Elizabeth's chancellor, Vorontsov. However, Vorontsov was paralysed by the notion that Peter would soon accede to the throne, and he didn't want to tell the Empress for fear that his own fortunes would take a nosedive once Elizabeth passed on. But there was one group who wouldn't take this lying down. The officers and the army detested Peter's machinations. He was going to put to ruin all that they had strove for. Frederick and Prussia were on the ropes. Victory was in sight, and Peter would have it all undone with the stroke of a pen. Thus, wherever Orlov and his faction went, they spread the bad word about Peter. More personally, Orlov was concerned what would become of Catherine. If Peter were forced to abdicate, what would become of her? Who should rule Russia? Orlov and his faction began to hatch a plan to bring Catherine to the throne of Russia. In the war, Russia was ascendant. Towards the end of 61, King Frederick had run out of luck, or so it seemed. Russian forces had crossed the Oder, and for 3 days Cossacks had managed to occupy Frederick's capital in Berlin. Still he fought on. Elizabeth, however, was on her last legs. On December the 23rd, she had a severe stroke. The doctors concurred that she wouldn't recover. Peter and Catherine were brought to her. She made Peter promise to look after Paul and to protect her lovers, Razumovsky and Shuvalov. Not a word was spoken to Catherine. On Christmas Day, Elizabeth asked for the prayer for those to pass on. She asked forgiveness of everybody in the room, per Orthodox custom, and then only a few hours later, she passed. A few minutes later, the President of the Senate announced to a crowd, Her Imperial Majesty Elizabeth Petrovna has fallen asleep in the Lord. May God preserve our gracious sovereign, the Emperor Peter III. Catherine was once again in a very precarious position. Her plans were still nebulous and unclear, but she realised she needed as much popular support as possible, whatever happened. For the 10 days prior to the funeral of Empress Elizabeth, the body lay in state in the Kazan Cathedral. Mourners came in their thousands to pay their respects, and there they saw a figure clad in black, kneeling on the stone floor beside Elizabeth, grieving the loss of her Empress. Catherine won many hearts through this action, and while her grief may well have been real, we can't look past this masterful consideration of optics here from Catherine. Peter, by contrast, was the opposite. He refused to kneel beside Elizabeth's body or to stand in vigil. When he made his rare appearances at the cathedral, he loudly chatted and joked with friends and even antagonised the priests. After the funeral, Peter was to make yet another mockery of Russian tradition. Here in the funeral procession, he marched behind the coffin, wearing a black mourning robe with a large train, which was then supported by many elderly noblemen. Peter took great pleasure in slowing down and then stopping, while the coffin, drawn by horses, continued to move. Peter would then run to catch up, and these elderly noblemen, well, they weren't able to keep up with Peter, and so had to let go of the robe train, resulting in it flapping about wildly in the wind. This act of mockery shocked everybody, the noblemen, the military, and the Russian people. Still, in the weeks that followed, the Emperor Peter made several popular moves. He reduced the tax on salt, he ended the compulsory state and military service for the nobility, and he also granted them freedom to come and go from country as they pleased during peacetime. But mostly, Peter spent his time acting like the buffoon that he was known for, partying and carousing, engaging in games unbecoming of a monarch. Things began to turn, though, when Peter turned his eye upon the Orthodox Church. He decided it was time to follow in the footsteps of his beloved Frederick and turn his nose up at the priests. To these ends, he nationalised all church property, placing it under a government department. He banned the veneration of icons, stating that only Jesus Christ was to be worshipped. Any carving, statue or painting of a saint was to be removed from church grounds. Then he made things more personal. He stipulated that all priests were to shave their beards and abandon their long flowing robes and were only to wear shorter, simpler, black robes like that of Lutheran pastors. In Easter, the traditional religious processions were banned. Rumours abounded that Peter was a pagan, or even worse, that he was a Protestant. In fact, Peter had informed the Archbishop of Novgorod that he was going to build a Protestant chapel in his winter palace. To the Archbishop's shock and protest, Peter shouted at him that the man was a fool and that any religion good enough for Frederick the Great should be just as good enough for Russia. But of perhaps even a greater sin for the new monarch was the loss of confidence in him among the officer corps. Already suspicious of Peter's love for Prussia, he quickly began to offend them. Everything from uniforms to battlefield tactics were to be modelled on Prussia. Peter would appear before the Russian soldiers in a blue Prussian-style uniform and then drill them for hours in the Germanic style. He enforced that even his generals were to partake. This amused Peter to no end to see old, rotund men, respected men, barely fitting into their uniforms and awkwardly trying to follow the Prussian style. He then replaced his Russian bodyguard, drawn from the famed Preobrazhensky regiment, with his Holstein troops. He declared that he was going to disband the Russian Imperial Guard at large and integrate them into the regular Russian forces. But the cherry on the top of this scandal was the appointment of his Holstein uncle, Peter Lewis, a man who had never held any military command, as the Field Marshal of the Russian army. Peter was only just getting started, however, and he quickly ceased hostilities with Prussia. A ceasefire quickly turned into peace, and peace into a full-blown military alliance with Prussia, including a return to Prussia of all the lands that Russian soldiers had paid the ultimate price to win. The military and nobility were outraged, and they were primed for a change. Where was Catherine in all this? In large part cloistered, heavily pregnant by this point. Had Peter become aware of the pregnancy, it would have been just the case he needed to have her divorced and removed. It was April the 11th that she finally gave birth to her son, Alexis. Orlov and Catherine kept her labour a secret by a clever machination of her valet, Shuriken. Knowing that Peter loved to watch fires, this valet set his own house ablaze, and true to form, Peter departed to watch the fire. Shuriken was able to spirit the baby out of the palace without anybody being any the wiser. 2 weeks later, Catherine emerged and was greeted warmly by dignitaries on her 33rd birthday. At the end of April, Peter hosted a banquet to celebrate his alliance with Prussia. At this banquet, Catherine was seated far away from Peter, an obvious snub. Peter proposed a toast to the imperial family. When Catherine did not rise, Peter was infuriated and sent a messenger down the table to demand to know why she hadn't risen to toast. She responded that since the imperial family consisted of him, herself and her son, she did not think it was appropriate to rise. Peter bellowed across the hall, "You fool!" The guests were shocked and appalled. Later that night he ordered Catherine to be arrested and imprisoned. It was only the intercession of Catherine's uncle and the new head of the Russian army, Prince George of Holstein, that managed to save her. He explained to Peter that arresting Catherine might create a full-on rebellion in the army. To Catherine, this was a turning point. In a letter she wrote to her one-time partner, Poniatowski, Catherine states, "This is when I began to take seriously the proposals to be rid of Peter that people had been making to me since the passing of the Empress." Prince George of Holstein was right to be concerned. Tensions in St. Petersburg had been growing. Peter had not even yet been officially coronated, and he had decided that he was going to go to war with Denmark to recover a slither of Holstein territory that Denmark had confiscated decades earlier. Peter, at the height of his mania, was determined to play an active role in this war, to leave St. Petersburg and to see to the preparations. The officer corps, the army and the nobility were all livid. It was stain enough that all that had been won by years of hard war was simply given away due to Peter's whims. Now they had to go to a distant land and fight an army that they had no quarrel with. It was too much to bear, and dissension and mutiny were discussed at large. Even Frederick of Prussia cautioned Peter against it, but finding himself unable to persuade Peter, settled on trying to convince Peter that he should at least imprison the unreliables, have himself coronated, and station his Holstein troops in the capital to maintain order. Peter would have none of it. There is little risk, he told Frederick. When one knows how to deal with Russians, one can be quite sure of them. How wrong those words would turn out to be. In early June, Peter departed St. Petersburg for Oranienbaum to set about drilling his Holstein battalions. With Peter out of the capital, the gears of the coup began to turn. The Orlovs by luck had been appointed to oversee distribution of wine and payments in the Imperial Guards, and boy did the money and wine begin to flow, all in the name of Catherine. The Guards could thus be counted upon. In the government, Pannon gathered his allies and served as Catherine's chief advisor in the plot. They co-opted the powerful Count Razumovsky among their number, who had been personally embarrassed by Peter during one of his drill sessions. Razumovsky was a colonel in the Izmailovsky Guards, and the leader of the Cossacks, and the president of the Academy of Sciences. At the critical juncture, Razumovsky had ordered the director of the printing presses to have a manifesto printed, proclaiming the news that Peter had abdicated and Catherine had assumed power, ready to be distributed when the plot was put in motion. After Razumovsky made him party to treason by knowledge, the director saw no path but to comply. The plan put forth by Pannon was to seize Peter when he returned from Oranienbaum to St. Petersburg for an official parade of the Guards set to depart for the campaign. But all did not go to plan. One of the conspirators, a captain in the Guards by the name of Pasek, was bailed up by a concerned soldier who had heard a rumour that Catherine had been arrested. Pasek dismissed the rumour as nonsense, but the soldier wasn't satisfied and found another officer, one who just happened to be not in on the plot. This officer had both the soldier and Captain Pasek arrested, and a report was sent to Peter and Oranienbaum. Here Peter made a critical error. He saw that the most important ministers of state were still with him, and dismissed the warning. Later, he received another warning letter, reported unrest in the capital, but Peter was busy with his violin, and set the letter aside to be read later. And he didn't remember to read that letter. In Petersburg, in the early hours of the morning, the plotters were alarmed. Pasek, if interrogated, would likely betray the entire conspiracy. They had to move now. Catherine had to be proclaimed Empress, even without the arrest of Peter. At 5 a.m, Catherine, staying at Peterhof just outside of Petersburg, was awakened by a maid. Minutes later, in burst Alexis Orlov. "Little mother, the time has come. You must get up and come with me. Everything is ready for your proclamation." Catherine was taken aback and asked what the meaning of this was. Orlov responded that Pasek had been arrested. It was now or never. Without a further word, Catherine threw on a black dress, and they departed by coach for a barracks of the Izmailovsky Guards, having to persuade a farmer on the way to borrow his horses to replace their own at one point. The pair arrived around 9 a.m. To the gathering crowd of soldiers, Catherine proclaimed that her life and that of her sons had been put at risk by the Emperor. But that was not all. She was not doing it just for self-preservation, but for her love of Russia and the Orthodox faith. That she was forced to seek their protection at this moment. Then Count Razumovsky came forward and knelt before her, kissing her hand. The chaplain of the regiment came forth and gave the oath of allegiance to Catherine II of Russia. There the entire regiment surrounded Catherine, marched to the Semyonovsky Guards barracks, where they too swore allegiance to Catherine. From there, the growing force marched upon St. Petersburg. Entering the city, they escorted her to the Cathedral of Our Lady of Kazan, where the Archbishop of Novgorod proclaimed her sovereign autocrat and her son Paul the heir. Crowds came out onto the streets as church bells rang throughout the city. Only the Preobrazhensky guards wavered. Most of the soldiers were for Catherine, but a number of their senior officers couldn't bring themselves to break their oath of allegiance to Peter. As Catherine and the force made for the Winter Palace, the soldiers of the Preobrazhensky guards took matters into their own hands and had these uncertain officers arrested. Soon they too joined Catherine at the Winter Palace. Here Pannon produced the 8-year-old Paul to Catherine, but seeing her on the balcony in front of adoring crowds of guardsmen and countrymen, he abandoned his plan to have her serve as regent. It was Catherine who would be Empress of Russia. Just then Shuvalov and Vorontsov appeared. They had been sent by Peter to investigate why Catherine wasn't at Peterhof, where Peter had travelled to celebrate his name day. Arriving at the capital to an evident coup, Shuvalov and Vorontsov tried to dissuade Catherine from taking up arms against her husband. Catherine, embodying the notion of show, don't tell, merely told them to go out onto the balcony before the thousands of crowds beneath the Winter Palace. And as they did so, she said, "Deliver your message to them. It is they who command here. I only obey." Before the night was out, both Shuvalov and Vorontsov would pledge allegiance to Catherine II. Catherine and her faction weren't out of the woods just yet though. Peter remained at large. There was a Russian navy at Kronstadt, with a large Russian army awaiting Peter already in Prussia. If he managed to escape there would surely be civil war. Here, Catherine showed her decisiveness, her willingness to take calculated risks to improve her chances, and most importantly, her flair for the dramatic. She would divide her forces. The larger part would ride out to arrest Peter, while the rest maintained order in Petersburg. But leading these forces would be Catherine herself. She had made herself a colonel in the Preobrazhensky Guards, and borrowing this piece of kit from one soldier and this piece from another, she fashioned herself a uniform of the Guards. The imagery here was no mistake. The Preobrazhensky Guards were formed by Peter the Great. He was their founder and leader, and now another sovereign would lead them into battle. There was only one piece missing, a sword knot. A young guardsman emerged from the ranks to hand this to her. The Empress accepted, and when asked his name, the young soldier responded, "Grigory Potemkin." This chance meeting was to be a fateful one in years to come. Dressed and readied, Catherine mounted a white stallion and rode out at the head of her army. It's hard to imagine just how thrilling this moment would have been for Catherine. All those years of patient ambition, of careful manoeuvring, of building social and political capital, and she was on the verge of absolute power. As Catherine rode with her army to Oranienbaum, she had Admiral Talzin, the head of the Russian Navy, dispatched to Kronstadt to secure the loyalty of the Russian Baltic Fleet. Meanwhile, Shuvalov and Vorontsov, not having returned to Peterhof, had caused Peter some alarm. He dispatched a boat to Kronstadt, requesting 3,000 soldiers to help defend himself, but then in his uncertainty sent another with orders just to secure the fortress. One of Peter's advisors recommended that he ride for Petersburg and present himself to his troops. Another recommended he fled to Narva, 70 miles west, where part of his army destined for Holstein was mustering. His Holstein adjutant recommended he make for Holstein itself. Peter, instead, sent for his Holstein guards still at Oranienbaum to come to him at once and defend him. He declared he would fight at Peterhof to the end. The guards, however, accustomed to Peter's capriciousness and not knowing what it was they were defending him against, brought only wooden drill rifles. In the interim, his two messengers from Kronstadt returned with news that the fortress was secure. This news was outdated, as soon after they left, Admiral Talzin had arrived there and secured the loyalty of the fleet for Catherine. When Peter heard that Kronstadt was secure, he decided it would be safer there, and so he set sail. But when he arrived there, he was met with shouts from the fortress to keep away and not to approach. Peter yelled, "It is your emperor!" The reply was ice, straight to Peter's heart. "We have no emperor. Long live the Empress, Catherine II." Panicking now, Peter's galley departed once more. Reckoning Iranian bound to be the safer place, Peter ordered the boat to be sailed there. His Holstein troops could double back once he arrived. Upon reaching the palace, he learned that Catherine was marching on him with a large force. With no moves left to play, Peter would write a letter asking that if he renounced his crown and all claims, that he might only retire to Holstein with Elizabeth Vorontsova. Catherine received the letter and accepted the offer, but sent a messenger in turn demanding an explicit abdication. The abdication Peter produced read, "I, Peter, of my own free will, hereby solemnly declare, not only to the whole Russian Empire, but also to the whole world, that I will forever renounce the throne of Russia to the end of my days, nor will I ever seek to recover the same at any time or by anybody's assistance. And I swear this before God." It was over. Catherine had succeeded. Her life's ambition was now a reality. Her patience, her social intelligence, her wisdom and understanding of how to cultivate allies, of symbolism, of reputation, and of how to play the game had brought her to the crown of the largest land empire on earth. Peter would never get to see his beloved Holstein again. The Orlovs correctly determined that it would be far too risky to allow him to leave Russia. Peter would be imprisoned instead and would pass away under mysterious circumstances. Thus ended the short reign of Peter III. But the reign of Catherine the Great was just beginning. Join me next time for the second half of Inside the Mind of Catherine the Great, where we'll explore her reign, what earned her her moniker, and what her actions reveal about her mind. In the meantime, here's a couple of other videos to check out. Another Inside the Mind, a little bit raw, but the content is quite gripping. Or you can check out my video essay on tall poppy syndrome. Until next time.